Hey, students, this is Professor Gore, and this is the last recorded lecture topic for Module 1 in U.S. History 2. And so, just like the previous ones, this will be divided up into three different topics and so forth. So, the Gilded Age is a pretty fascinating time politically. It is the time period in American history of the greatest political participation of registered voters in American history. It's also the height of political corruption in American history as well. And really, the two major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, didn't differ that much on issues. There was issues of how much tariffs and so forth, and whether you should have civil service reform and whatnot. But during the Gilded Age, also, you have some of the worst presidents in American history. During the Reconstruction time period, you had Ulysses S. Grant, who had corruption in his administration. Before him, you had Andrew Johnson, who was one of our worst presidents in American history. Rutherford B. Hayes kind of flies under the radar in American history. And then you have James Garfield, who would have been predicted to be a good American president but gets assassinated. Then you get into Chester Arthur, who didn't do much besides build up the U.S. Navy. And then you get into Grover Cleveland, who won, lost, and then won again. Benjamin Harrison, into William McKinley. So we're going to talk about the Gilded Age, political time period, and so forth in three parts of this topic. So let's look at the politics of status quo. So this is going to pick up where Reconstruction ends, and Rutherford B. Hayes comes in with the Compromise of 1877. And so if you didn't have U.S. History 1, how Rutherford B. Hayes came into office is there was conflicting returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The Republicans claim they won those states. Most likely, Samuel Tilden, the Democratic candidate, probably won those, mainly because the redeemers of the kind of white South kind of prevents African Americans from voting, and so it allows Hayes to win the Electoral College, but then lose the popular vote. There was a deal, it's assumed to be made behind closed doors, where Hayes would be president so long as Reconstruction officially ends in the South. And so as soon as Hayes gets inaugurated, there's not pushback from the Democrats, and then they pull the remaining Union troops out of those three southern states. So this time period is really consistent with what's called laissez-faire government. It means like the government's hands off of the economy. And so they thought that the best government was the one that governed least. So you don't regulate industry, you don't regulate labor and so forth, and just kind of let the economy go as is. And so one of five presidents from 1877 to 1897, only one was a Democrat, and that's Grover Cleveland. And he's the only president in American history to serve two non-consecutive terms. The Republican presidents were Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, who didn't last very long, Chester Arthur, and Benjamin Harrison. All these men look good on paper, with Hayes serving as governor of Ohio for 3 terms. Garfield performed well as a congressional leader, and Arthur did well as head of the New York Customs House. And Cleveland performed well as mayor of Buffalo and governor of New York. None was a charismatic leader, but circumstances more than personal qualities explain why these presidents did not make a larger mark on history, as they were sometimes referred to as the forgettable presidents. Now, every presidential election from 1876 to 1892 was decided by a thin margin, thanks to the Democratic Party's comeback after Reconstruction. One of the ways the Democratic Party came back is they were able to get more Irish voters and immigrant voters and so forth. Also, differences between the two parties was muddy. It's not as clear distinctions as you see later. Republicans throughout the late 1800s are going to what's called wave the bloody shirt. It was really effective during Reconstruction, and that's usually have a piece of clothing with red on it. They would wave. They would remind Americans what party started the Civil War, the Democrats, and so forth. And they would try to use it throughout the late 1800s, and as time went along, it was less and less effective. Pensions for disabled veterans and their widows served as big issues, as well as a tariff. And so Republicans wanted to give Union veterans a pension, as well as their wives if they've already deceased. And then the Democrats were like, no, we shouldn't do that. And so Democrats kind of resisted because they thought it was extravagance and it was going to be ridden with fraud. And later, when they do implement it under Benjamin Harrison's presidency, there were young girls that would go out and marry these Union veterans So they were gold diggers in the 1880s. Now, one of the things that you'll see as well is the two big issues, or like I mentioned, is the tariff and the pension. So if you look right here, the shows you different states and so forth. The swing states were primarily New York because of the amount of Irish there. Also, you would see Nevada and California be swing states. And so if you could win those swing states, you typically won the election and so forth. And so you see the two-party balance. Notice they use two male chickens here because at one point in the mid-1800s, cockfighting was very prominent. And the individual whose head is on top of a rooster on the top right, that's supposed to be Roscoe Conkling, who was infamous for the spoils system for the Republican Party and so forth. So you really had some of the greatest loyalty in American history in voting. So if you look, 1876 is where it peaks in terms of voter turnout, right at the end of Reconstruction. And then you look at, by 1920, it's the lowest voter turnout. You had about just under 50% that voted in 1920 election. That's actually the first election that women got the right to vote. You would think that it would increase, but that's not the case. So who were typically Democrats? All right. Now, these weren't always stereotypically true, but generally speaking, they were true. White Southerners typically voted Democratic. Now, there were some white Southerners that voted Republican, but they were very much in the minority. Catholics up north, primarily, a lot of them voted Democrat, particularly among the Irish and German populations. Recent immigrants, especially Jews, these political machines are really good at recruiting recent immigrants to vote for their party. Also, the urban working poor, so those that were pro-labor. So you had a different, because you look at white Southerners versus the urban working class, that's a totally different group. For the Republicans, you typically see northern whites who are pro-business, African Americans that were able to vote, like southern states, they did things to prevent them from voting, but northern states and elsewhere, in some parts of the South, they tend to vote Republican. Northern Protestants tend to vote Republican, and also the nativists, they call the WASPs, who were anti-recent immigrants coming over. And most of the middle class, whether they were anti-immigrant or African-American, tended to vote Republican. Not always, but typically. All right. And so really, here's the main duties of the federal government in the Gilded Age. You deliver the mail, maintain a national military. There's going to be a few presidents that increase the military, particularly the United States Navy, which is going to allow the United States to do very well in the Spanish-American War. And then by 1910 or so, the United States is going to have the second largest Navy in the world, right behind Great Britain. Collect taxes and tariffs. Okay, so the tariffs were coming in from imported goods. There's no income tax at this time, so the taxes primarily were coming in on alcohol tax and conduct a foreign policy. There's going to be times when we get to in Module 2, and we talk about the American expansion time period, when the United States kind of gets involved in imperialism. We'll talk about that foreign policy in a later module. So now the exception is they do administer the annual Civil War veterans pensions. Now, one thing that should make you proud to be an American is what the federal government has done throughout its history to help and try to take care of veterans. Not a lot of governments in history have not done that. Like the Romans, if you served for 25 years, would give you land. Hence, Romania became a main settlement for former Roman soldiers. Hence, Romania. But the United States gave away land west of the Mississippi River. I'm sorry, west of the Appalachian Mountains, not the Mississippi River. After the Civil War, of course, they were giving Native American land. That's going to be a problem on many fronts. And so forth. You see, after the American Civil War, the United States gives pensions. You have the Veterans Affairs created after the World Wars. One of the greatest money the federal government's ever spent for veterans has been the GI Bill of Rights, and we'll cover that when we get to World War II. Well, really the years after World War II, during the 1950s and beyond, and leads to incredible opportunity for veterans that's still around today. Now, one of the things that you'll see as well is that because of political machines, party bosses are going to rule. And so really, one of the things is that political parties at this time thought that the presidency should try to avoid offending anybody. They didn't want any kind of group like the Irish or the Germans or the immigrants or white Southerners or whoever it may be, your middle class or something. They don't want to offend them, and so they wanted to try to appeal to as many people as possible. The probably the most well-known, or I should say infamous, congressman who was extremely involved in the spoils system is named Senator Roscoe Conkling. This is him, was in Congress, particularly in the 1870s and some of the 1860s. Believe it or not, he was seen as a good-looking man at the time and actually had an affair with another congressman's wife. And so the spoils system, how it operated is political supporters were supposed to be, or I should say influential political supporters, were supposed to be rewarded with federal government jobs. So the president would hand out federal government jobs as the federal government kind of expands in terms of the amount of jobs that it had. A lot of them were kind of do-nothing jobs. The president was supposed to act to the party boss, like Roscoe Conkling would tell them who to give the federal jobs to, and so forth. In 1865, you only had 53,000 Americans working for the federal government. By 1890, it's 166,000. Today, the federal government is the largest employer in the United States. And so really what you see is the Republican Party was fairly divided this time. You have the stalwarts who are all about the spoil system, spoils, reward political supporters and so forth. And then the half-breeds was led by James G. Blaine. And so they oftentimes argued over the direction of the Republican Party. The half-breeds wanted more, they wanted civil service reform. They didn't like the spoil system. They thought it was corruption. So in the election of 1880, they selected a compromise candidate, which actually historians think would have been a good and influential president in American history. He was very much revered and well respected for his time. So they kind of selected a compromise candidate. So Garfield would kind of represent one of the reformers, the half-breeds, and then Chester Arthur, who was one of Roscoe Conkling's right-hand men, would be the stalwarts representative. And so Garfield is going to get assassinated, which I'll cover in just a minute, and then Chester Arthur is going to become president. The only reason why he would have become president. Now, one of the things too that happens. The reason why Hayes was not selected for re-election by his own party was he called federal troops to stop the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 because the Great Railroad Strike of 1870 disrupted the mail service. Those that had U.S. History 1, we covered that during the Reconstruction lecture. And then also, we also covered that in the Capitalism and Labor lecture for this one. And he actually vetoed the Chinese Exclusion Act and then later is forced to sign into law. So because of the override of the veto. Now, the thing that also happens is the Democrats select Winfield Scott Hancock to run against him, and he is going to lose with William H. English as his running mate. And so election of 1880, whoever wins New York primarily won, and New York went to the Republicans, and so Garfield wins. Now, we'll talk about the Pendleton Civil Service Act. Although Garfield is not able to sign it into law because he gets assassinated, what happens to Garfield is there was a staunch Republican supporter named Charles Guiteau, and I'll show you a picture of him in just a minute. He did look insane, and he's the first person in American history to get out of the death penalty because of the insanity plea. And if you see a picture of him, you can tell the guy was insane. But he was a staunch supporter of the Republicans, and supposedly had met Garfield at a Republican dinner function. Garfield had no idea who he was. And so when Garfield comes into office, he doesn't get a federal government position. He is livid. And Charles Guiteau just walked up to him one day and shot him. And so it really was tragic and devastating because, presidential murders, we've had 4. And there's been others that have attempted to kill presidents, but Garfield, was literally killed by a guy who was insane. And so Arthur ends up coming into the presidency. Now, Arthur, who represented the stalwarts who are all about the spoil system, he actually signs the Pendleton Civil Service Act into law, which is surprising because it kind of goes against what he stands for. But he does anyway because he saw that it was what majority of Americans favored, which is typically what a president should do unless it's doing something immoral. But what it consisted of is a federal government employee, in order to be hired, it couldn't be based on political support. It had to be based on merit. Okay, and you typically had to take a civil service exam to show that you were competent for doing the job. For instance, you don't want to have somebody head of the U.S. Postal Service who's illiterate, and so it made it where it was based on qualifications, not based on who your scores were. So now, after the Penal Service Act goes into law in 1883, typically politicians were able to get support by giving them federal government jobs to get votes. Not all the voters, certainly, but they started going to donations from corporations. And this is where you're going to see big business sway a lot of political mindset at this time as well. So here is Guteau. He had a little, you tell, it's hard to tell from this black and white image, but I've seen another image of him, and he had some crazy looking eyes. He is the assassin. And Shasta Arthur, who had one of the most interesting facial hair setups of all time, who actually loved to shop at Brooks Brothers, random fact for you, which is one of the oldest American men's clothiers in the nation. And so Garfield died about 11 weeks after getting assassinated. If he'd have been alive in modern medicine, Garfield would have survived easily. If Ronald Reagan, who gets shot in the 1980s, had been alive at this time, he would have died pretty quickly. But Garfield would have lived with modern medicine, and that's tragic. So one of the things that you will see as well is the Pendleton Act will lead to campaign donations from corporations. Okay. Now the mugwumps. These were the people who abandoned the Republican Party and vote Democrat in the election of 1884. Now, James G. Blaine, who was a half-breed, he was the nickname was James G. Blaine, the crooked politician from the state of Maine. And so this election was noted for its personal attacks on the two candidates. What prevented Blaine from winning the election were the Mulligan letters that Blaine had written to a bossless businessman linking Blaine to a corrupt deal involving a Southern railroad. This led to people supporting Cleveland instead. In New York, which is a big swing state, goes to Democrats. Those that joined the Democrats were called mugwumps for being holier than thou. They thought they were kind of being better than James G. Blaine. They just felt like that Blaine was tainted. Cleveland was associated with an affair, because Cleveland actually comes to the presidency as a bachelor. Now he does get married in the White House. He does meet his wife, and then they end up having a son later. But what Cleveland supposedly had an affair with a Buffalo widow, and supposedly fathered her 8-year-old illegitimate child. And so what ends up happening is they made this crazy little saying, ma, where's my pa? Talking about Cleveland. And then whenever he wins, the Democrats chant, well, he's gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. So, but really even though the mugwumps jumped the Republican Party and voted for Democrat, but really what kind of pushed over Cleveland to win was what happens with the Irish, particularly the Roman Catholic majority. There was one of his main supporters, a guy named James Buchanan, had made an anti-Catholic slur, and James G. Blaine didn't really call him out on it. So now Cleveland, when he comes into office, he was a reformer for governor, and done a pretty good job as governor. But one of the things that he was very honest about, he says, though the people support the government, the government should not support the people. Now, if you said that today, you can forget about ever serving in the White House ever again. But he had said that quote after refusing to give seeds for farmers in Texas who were suffering from a major drought in the 1880s. Cleveland vetoed a record number of private pension bills, as well as a general legislation for indigent veterans. Cleveland ended up firing nearly 80,000 federal employees to hire Democrats instead. So Cleveland, that's going to be controversial. He also proposed that Congress lower the tariff despite big businesses being against it. So here is Grover Cleveland, gets married in the White House. James G. Blaine loses. This is a political cartoon, ma, where's my pa? And of course, when he wins, he's gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. And this is, I love this political cartoon. This is James G. Blaine dressed up as Little Bo Peep and all the sheep that have left him. So Little Bo Peep has lost his sheep. It's a famous nursery rhyme. And this is James Buchanan, who made the anti-Catholic remark. And also Dr. Samuel Butchert as well. So Cleveland wins. And because mainly he wins the state of New York, very important. And he was very much a laissez-faire president. That's going to come back to bite him because it's going to play into Benjamin Harrison becoming president after him. And then Cleveland's going to make a comeback when Harrison is not seen as doing a very good job. Okay. Now, one of the things that happens is their tariffs has brought in $100 million in surplus. Now, if you ever thought, when has the federal government ever not been in debt? Well, it's not in debt right now. It's not in debt under Andrew Jackson, and it's got a surplus in the 1880s, which was great. The United States is actually going to give that surplus away to Civil War veterans. Okay. And so tariffs, those that favor tariffs to protect American industry voted Republican election of 1888. Those who favored lowering tariffs are going to vote for Cleveland, and Cleveland's not going to have enough votes to win in the election of 1888. Now, Benjamin Harrison's kind of an interesting guy. His grandfather was the famous William Henry Harrison, who became president in the election of 1840, but died 36 days in office from pneumonia. Famous Native American fighter and supposedly hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. His father had served in the U.S. Senate, and now Benjamin Harrison was a president himself. So you had a president, senator, and then another president as well. Now, one of the things that was known for the election of 1888 is that a lot of people were paid to vote. And this was pretty common during the Gilded Age politically, because back then there was no secret ballot. That's called the Australian ballot, because Australia was one of the first places to implement it. And so workers were told by their business owners, you need to vote for Harrison or you're not going to have a job. And so this is a political cartoon talking about that. And so the whip of coercion is whipping the workers into voting for Harrison. Height of political corruption in American history. What's interesting, I read a book on Gilded Age politics, and there was all kind of stuff that was happening at the local level. Let me give you a few highlights. And both parties did this. So both parties were corrupt at various levels of government during this time. But they would register, both parties at different parts of the country would register dead voters and have people that would say they were somebody who was dead. They would steal the ballot boxes. You'd have, and this is kind of funny, at one point, can't remember which party did this, but one had stolen the ballot box and then put it with another one, and then the other party stole that one and replaced it with another one, ended up putting back the wrong one, and the party who originally stole ended up putting back the one that gave the other party the victory. I mean, it was crazy stuff like that. You could be paid more to vote depending on which occupation you were. So if you were a doctor, you were paid more than if you were a tenant farmer. And so you can see New York goes Republican, and Harrison's going to win the election. Now, Harrison, there was always political cartoons of him wearing a huge hat that was like too big for him. It was saying the hat of his grandfather, Benjamin Harrison, or William Henry Harrison. And eventually, by the end of his presidency, when he was not very successful, the hat kind of consumed him. But they're saying this one is that he's throwing the $100 million surplus down the drain for Civil War veterans. Not Confederate veterans, but Union veterans. So Cleveland won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College, and they called this the $1 billion Congress and so forth because they had that surplus. There was also the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890 that was passed during Harrison's presidency that hurt farmers, forcing them to buy manufactured goods from high-priced, protected American industrialists, but were compelled to sell their own agricultural products into highly competitive, unprotected world markets. So farmers didn't like the tariff, okay? Very much so. Okay. Now, it's also one of the things that farmers push for is what's called the push for silver. Now, if you know anything about currency, gold is worth more than silver. Okay, and so farmers at this time felt like that their great problem was that they just didn't have enough access to currency. And so because there was the largest silver discovery in North America at Comstock Lode, Nevada, they thought that, hey, if we have unlimited coinage of silver, it'll increase the currency supply, and then we'll be able to pay off our debts easier to banks. Now, what the farmers didn't realize, they hadn't had a basic course in economics, that if you flood the market with silver, it's going to lead to inflation. And so, yes, they may have more income coming in to pay off their loans for their farm equipment or their lands, But what's going to happen is he's going to drive up the cost of everything, and it's going to be kind of negated with inflation. And so the industrialists favored the gold currency and keeping currency less, so gold was worth more and so forth. And that's going to be a political battle at this time and leads to the rise of the Populist Party. And so McKinley tariff helped American businesses but hurt farmers. Remember this, because this is going to hurt sugar farming in Hawaii. And there were American sugar planters who had gone down to Hawaii to sell, to grow and cultivate sugar. And this tariff put a much higher tariff on Hawaiian sugar. And that's going to help encourage these sugar farmers to overtake Hawaii from Queen Lulukalani. And later we'll learn in Module 2 that President McKinley is going to annex Hawaii during the Spanish-American War. And if it wasn't for the sugar planters overtaking it, it would never have been annexed. Now, social Darwinism, as I've covered in the Capitalism and Labor lecture, but I want to come back to it here because it's very important to understand. British philosopher Herbert Spencer came up with this idea after an elaborate analysis of how human society had advanced through competition known as survival of the fittest. So it's taken Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species in 1859 and applying it to society. And so really the Yale sociology professor, William Graham Sumner, is the one who gets credit for the name. And he's the one that argued at Yale that millionaires were that way because they were the fittest in society. And so it was used to justify wealth at this time and also used to justify laissez-faire government and so forth. Okay. So those that were poor because they were lazy, and those that were rich because they were strong and fit and not necessarily like bowed up, like working out in the gym, but had ambition and they had the talent and so forth. And so the 20th century, especially after the Nazis, are going to prove social Darwinism incorrect. All right, we're going to come back to, in part 2, the protection the Supreme Court provides corporations during the Gilded Age.